look back over church history, we can see the strength of a spark. We can see an unbroken chain of gospel succession. Do you know the name William Wilberforce? He's the man who is pretty much credited with ending the slave trade that was happening in England in the 19th century. There's a movie about him that came out a few years ago called Amazing Grace. It's a great film. I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to go watch it and just see the remarkableness of this man's life and what he was able to accomplish. But what you won't see in the film is the story before the story. You won't see the gospel succession that had taken place. In the early 17th century, 2 centuries prior, a Cambridge preacher named Richard Sibbes wrote a book about the comforting work of Christ called The Bruised Reed. A man who was a tinker. Do you know what that is? Anyone know what that is? I didn't know what it was either, and I looked it up. And a tinker is someone who travels around fixing metal utensils. So there you go. Next time you play whatever that game is, Trivial Pursuit, you'll know what a tinker is. But this tinker came across this book, and he read it, and then he traveled to another town, and he handed the book to a young boy named Richard Baxter. Baxter would grow up to be one of the great preachers of the late 17th century. And he would write a book called A Call to the Unconverted, which made a dramatic difference in the life of Philip Doddridge in the early 18th century. Doddridge, as a response to what he read in Baxter's book, wrote his own book called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. And it was this book that God used to save William Wilberforce. It was this book that brought William Wilberforce face to face with Jesus. And not only did this book save William from his sin, but it called him to his holy calling. A calling that you and I are so thankful for. A calling that led to the abolition of slavery. See, this gospel succession led to not just the personal salvation of William Wilberforce, but there being salvation brought to things that were lost, to things beyond himself. Even today, if you say the name Wilberforce, he is seen as a heroic figure in the fight against evil. So like I said last week, the gospel is both the message and the method of salvation. The gospel is the power of God for saving us and bringing salvation to all that is lost. And as we look at this final letter, this last will and testament, as it were, of Paul, as he's writing to this young preacher, Timothy, we see how much the gospel is consuming Paul. That as he lay preparing to die, that's all he can think about. All he can think about is this gospel. Because you see, Paul knew that the church would endure forever because Jesus said that. Jesus said, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But Paul also knew that in any particular culture, the church is never more than one generation away from extinction. If the gospel isn't proclaimed and taught and passed on.